Ancient engineers really woke up and chose violence. Should we build a wall? Nah, let's build a pit full of poop-tip stakes instead. Welcome to the creative horror show that was ancient military defense. Sumer's DIY impalement pits. So you're walking near the city walls of Lagash, thinking maybe you'll sneak in, do a little raiding, grab some loot. Bad idea. Because the Sumerians didn't just build cities, they built warnings. One of those warnings? A trench, covered with brush, filled with sharpened wooden spikes. If you were lucky, you landed feet first. If not, well, let's just say you wouldn't walk out. These weren't just random holes. They were dug in straight lines, funneling enemies into tight spaces, where soldiers with spears waited on the other end. The Stele of the Vultures, an ancient limestone slab from around 2400 BCE, literally shows bodies skewered on poles. That's how proud they were of this. This wasn't just defense, this was psychological warfare. You show up to fight and immediately see 10 of your friends stuck like meat on kebabs. That's the real morale killer. And if the impalement didn't finish you, the filth did. Wooden stakes weren't just sharp, but sometimes smeared with feces. Why? Because infection works slower than a spear but still gets the job done. Welcome to ancient germ warfare. Lagash wasn't the only one doing it. Other Sumerian cities like Umma and Kish had similar trench setups, often protecting irrigation canals or trade routes. These cities were at war more often than they were at peace, and they got creative with low-tech death. Even early legal codes, like the laws of Ur-Kagina, mention punishments involving bodily mutilation for thieves. It wasn't a leap to go from cutting off a hand to just ending the problem at the bottom of a pit. Next time someone tells you ancient warfare was honorable, show them the vulture stele. The only honor here was making sure your enemy didn't even make it to the front gate. And yeah, Sumer gave us writing, math, and beer. But it also gave us the kind of backyard project that turns invaders into fertilizer. Welcome to Ancient Warfare. Chapter 1 just stabbed you in the foot. Egypt's Desert Surprise. The New Kingdom Egyptians were builders. Temples, obelisks, tombs, you name it. But when Pharaoh Thutmose III wasn't expanding Egypt's skyline, he was expanding its borders. And he didn't do it with kindness. When Egyptian forces rolled into Canaan or Nubia, they didn't just fight. They trapped, flanked, and humiliated their enemies using the land like a co-conspirator. You think you're marching toward a city? You're actually walking into a funnel lined with archers, spears, and a chariot squad itching for warm-up kills. They didn't need sand-covered spike pits. They had better. Natural bottlenecks, canyon choke points, and ambush curves. Egyptian troops mastered these tight spaces. Foreign soldiers would get baited into a rocky pass, and just when they thought they were in formation, bam! Arrows from above, infantry from the sides. No room to retreat, no room to breathe. And they bragged about it. Reliefs carved into the walls of the Karnak temple don't just show victories, they show massacres. Whole lines of enemy troops falling, fleeing, or being dragged off like cattle. Egypt recorded history the only way they knew how, through domination. The reliefs at Karnak aren't there to impress you. They're there to remind everyone who got crushed, how hard, and by whom. The annals of Thutmose III, carved into those same walls, detail these campaigns with an accountant's cold precision. They log the names of conquered towns, lists of tribute, tallies of livestock, gold, and bound captives. Inscriptions describe cities flattened like grain, and rebellious rulers trampled beneath Pharaoh's sandals. That's not a metaphor, that's the official record. And the way it's phrased? Cold, proud, and completely unapologetic. And this wasn't just for foreigners. Rebellious vassals and Egyptian subjects who stepped out of line got the exact same treatment. If you lived near the border and thought you could stir up trouble, Egypt made sure the road you took out of town became the last road you ever touched. They didn't lay traps with sticks and leaves. They laid them with topography, timing, and pure royal spite. The ground itself became part of the army. Geography wasn't just something you marched across. It was something that could kill you. So, if you were a soldier heading toward an Egyptian stronghold, you had to look down, look up, and look behind. Because, in Thutmose's campaigns, even the dirt might be working against you. Hittite fire doors. The Hittites weren't the most famous ancient empire, but they absolutely deserved a seat at the "you're gonna die screaming" table. Around 1300 BCE, these folks ruled a massive chunk of Anatolia, and weren't shy about getting creative when it came to war. Their specialty? Making you regret opening the front door. Fortresses in places like Hattusa, their capital, had trapdoors, literal ones. Some city gates were rigged with pots of flammable oil or resin mounted just above the main entryways. These weren't decorative. The second invading troops breached the door. The pots would be tipped or smashed. You're now soaked in ancient napalm. And then, the defenders lit it. The mix likely included pine resin, bitumen, and animal fat. Thick, sticky, and nearly impossible to extinguish. If that combo sounds familiar, it's because it's eerily close to the ingredients of Greek fire, just 800 years earlier. The Hittites didn't invent flamethrowers, but they didn't need to. They just built death showers. Archaeological digs at Hattusa have revealed layers of charred entryways and scorched stonework, especially near choke points like staircases and tunnels. That's not campfire damage. That's, you tried to sneak in, and now you're extra crispy damage. But the fire traps weren't the only surprise waiting behind those gates. Once you got inside, defenders didn't exactly roll out the welcome mat. Some passages turned out to be tight kill zones. Some doorways led nowhere. Others? They opened just long enough for you to feel hope, right before closing behind you with archers waiting above. The Hittites didn't need illusions. They had stone, heat, and zero mercy. Everything was built to slow you down, break you apart, and leave you trapped while the walls did the rest. The brilliance here wasn't just the fire, it was the bait. The Hittites made it easy to almost get in. Easy enough that you'd think you won, and then they'd torch you. And don't forget, the Hittites were fighting Egyptians, Assyrians, and rebellious mountain tribes, so they weren't testing these ideas in theory. These traps were field-tested, blood-certified, and carved into stone records for posterity. Assyria's welcome wall collapsed. Assyria didn't do mercy. They did warning shots made of human skin, iron-tipped siege weapons, and architectural booby traps that made sure your whole army thought twice. By 800 BCE, the Neo-Assyrian Empire had mastered the art of defend by destroying. Let's say you're an enemy soldier charging toward a breach in the city wall. It looks abandoned. The gate's open. There's even a path cleared. You and your buddies rush in, only to trigger a deadfall. The ceiling collapses. Side walls crumble inward. If the rocks don't crush you, the spike-lined pit underneath will. And if that doesn't kill you, the arrow volleys from the flanking towers will make sure you don't tell anyone about your bad life choices. Assyrian reliefs from Nineveh and Nimrud aren't subtle. They show conquered people trampled, forced to kneel, or dragged off amid ruined cities. You don't see cartoon-style traps, but you do see unstoppable force. The message? Invade at your peril. Assyrian imperial power didn't trick you with collapsing floors. They crushed you under steel, siege engines, and sheer terror. They also had layered trap zones. First wave? Spike pits? Second wave? Flaming oil? Third? Slingers and archers hiding behind murder holes. Assyria didn't believe in a one-step death. They believed in multi-phase humiliation. And here's the psychological cherry on top. Assyrians loved publishing their brutality. Kings like Ashur-nisirpal II and Tiglath-Pileser III wrote about these traps in public inscriptions, bragging about how many enemies fell screaming into the earth, or were buried in their own ambition. That's a quote. Assyrian engineers also got creative in siege defense. If they thought a wall was going to be breached, they'd reinforce the area behind it with decoy corridors, narrow passageways, and sharpened wooden stakes disguised under clay floors. Enemy troops who forced their way through would be bottlenecked and then butchered. It's not that the Assyrians wanted to fight fair. They wanted to fight once, and win so hard no one else dared try. China's crossbow surprise. Long before drones and motion sensors, China figured out how to shoot you in the face the second you opened the wrong door. Around 500 BCE, during the Warring States period, the Chinese weren't just building walls. They were building mechanical death machines and stuffing them into hallways. The trap of choice? The repeating crossbow rig. Here's how it worked. A wooden frame mounted on a wall, loaded with a cocked crossbow. The bolt was held back by a simple latch, usually tied to a silk string or bamboo trigger wire. Step on the pressure plate or break the line, the latch releases. Bolt flies. You drop. Simple, silent, fast. And the real kicker? These weren't always single-shot deals. Some were designed with multiple crossbows wired to the same trigger, aiming at head, chest, and knees. So even if you ducked, you still lost something. These devices weren't just military but were installed in tombs. That's right. You raid a tomb looking for gold and get a bolt straight through your skull instead. The tomb of King Lu Sheng, died 113 BCE, discovered in Hebei province, had evidence of booby trap rigs placed along burial chamber corridors. Spring-loaded doors and carved stone grooves suggest crossbow traps were installed and later removed or decayed. Even ancient manuals like the Mozi, a military philosophy text from the 4th century BCE, describe automated defense weapons and mechanical trap layouts, especially for defending fortresses and supply routes. The idea was to hold ground with minimal soldiers, let the trap do the killing while you sip tea on the parapet. The Chu and Qin states were especially fond of using terrain to their advantage. Crossbows were hidden behind rock faces in mountain passes, or fake wooden doors in forest outposts. Enemy troops, thinking they'd found a back entrance, would get nailed by bolts the second they stepped into the kill zone. And if you somehow survived the first bolt, there was a backup string wired to a second launcher. China didn't invent cruelty, but they did automate it. Greek fire tunnels. The Greeks are famous for democracy, drama, and fighting each other every 5 minutes. But during the Greco-Persian Wars, they discovered something else. Nothing ruins an invasion like setting the ground on fire under your enemy's feet. Around 480 BCE, while King Leonidas was busy dying gloriously at Thermopylae, other Greeks were laying out the less cinematic part of the war, booby traps. One particularly nasty trick? Fire tunnels. Here's how it worked. Defenders dug narrow shafts under roads or siege ramps where they expected enemy troops to advance. These tunnels were filled with a toxic cocktail: sulfur, pine resin, dry wood, tar, sometimes even animal fat. Think of it as ancient napalm, but more creative and less regulated. When the enemy reached the target zone above, someone below struck a flame. The air lit up, the ground caved in, and suddenly your sandals are on fire, along with everything else. This was recorded during the defense of Greek cities like Plataea and Delium. Sources like Thucydides, Book 4, Peloponnesian War, describe the use of fire tunnels in defending city walls. At Delium in 424 BCE, defenders used a pipe and bellows system to blow flames and smoke into enemy trenches. Tactical arson. But the groundwork for this type of trap came even earlier during the Persian invasions. Excavations at Thermopylae show charred soil layers and collapsed passages that match tunnel-burning tactics. Greek engineers used their knowledge of terrain and wind to turn battlefields into ovens. And if the Persians brought siege towers? Even better, tunnels were dug underneath, fires were lit, and the towers collapsed in a fiery heat before ever reaching the wall. Sometimes they didn't even wait for the enemy to come. If troops were hiding in a tunnel or narrow canyon, Greeks would block the exit, pour in the fuel, and light the middle. The oxygen would suck inward, turning the tunnel into a giant wind tunnel of hell. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't honorable. But it worked. The Persians had numbers. The Greeks had matches. Rome's backyard spike garden. Julius Caesar didn't just conquer. He booby-trapped his enemies into submission. By 52 BCE, during his famous campaign in Gaul, Caesar got sick of Gallic ambushes and decided to flip the script by turning the battlefield into a landmine. Enter the Lilia. Sounds lovely, right? Like flowers? Yeah, no. These were shallow cone-shaped pits, each about 3 feet deep, with sharpened wooden stakes at the bottom. They were placed in clusters, spaced just right so no horse or soldier could avoid them. Covered with twigs, grass, and a dusting of dirt, they looked harmless. Until you stepped in. Caesar wrote about them in Commentarii de Bello Gallico, Book 7. During the siege of Alesia, he ordered thousands of these traps dug in front of his defensive walls. He called them lilies because of their shape. The Gauls probably had other names for them, none of them polite. But that was just part of the setup. In front of the lilia came rows of caltrops, small iron spikes designed to always have one point facing upward. They'd slice through horse hooves, sandals, or anything with skin. And if someone survived both, behind that was a network of trenches, palisades, and hidden archers. It was a buffet of pain, in layers. And Caesar wasn't even defending his city. He was laying siege to their city. That's how insane this was. He surrounded Alesia with walls, then ringed those walls with death traps. The Gauls tried to break out. Other Gauls tried to break in. Neither made it very far. Archaeologists at the Alesia site in modern-day France have found actual remains of these traps, sharpened wooden stakes still embedded in the soil, grouped in patterns that match Caesar's own account. That's next-level documentation. Here's how I trapped and shredded thousands of men. Also, enjoy the footnotes. Romans used these methods again in Britain against tribal resistance. You think Boudicca's chariots were terrifying? Not when they're flipping over into spike holes and the horses are bleeding from their hooves. Rome didn't invent the ambush, but they did industrialize it. Celtic log smashers. So you're a Roman soldier marching through a Celtic forest in Gaul. Everything's quiet. Too quiet. You hear a twig snap. You turn your head, and a tree just punched you in the face. Welcome to Celtic hospitality. Around 50 BCE, during the Roman campaigns under Caesar, Celtic tribes didn't just rely on spears and screaming. They turned their forests into death mazes. One of their favorite tools? The swinging log trap. Here's how it worked. Picture a large tree trunk or several hollowed out, filled with rocks or fitted with spikes, and suspended horizontally between two trees using twisted vines or ropes. It's held in place by a simple catch mechanism tied to a tripwire stretched across the forest path. You step on the wire, the catch snaps, and bam, you're getting flattened by a wooden battering ram swinging at face level. It wasn't just one log either. Sometimes there were 2 or 3, set at different angles. If one missed, the next wouldn't. These traps weren't folklore. Roman military accounts like Caesar's Commentary mention ambushes arranged by terrain, and while they don't go into poetic detail, Romans didn't like to admit they got outsmarted. Archaeological digs in France and Germany have uncovered sharpened stakes, felled trees positioned across trails, and even preserved vine rope structures in bogs. Another trick? Undermined roots. Celts would dig out the roots of a tree and brace it with sticks. When Romans passed below, a hidden observer yanked out the braces and gravity did the rest. No magic. Just physics and patience. The Celts were experts in using terrain. Their forests were thick, visibility was low, and the paths were narrow. Perfect conditions for timed, high-impact chaos. And unlike Romans, Celtic warriors didn't wear heavy armor. So when the log fell, guess who got crushed? The shiny guy with the eagle on his helmet. These weren't just traps, they were statements. You don't belong here, in the form of blunt force trauma. So next time someone tells you the Celts were primitive, remind them they turned the woods into a blender. Parthian trap retreats. The Parthians didn't just beat Rome, they baited it. In 53 BCE, General Crassus, the richest man in Rome, led a massive army into the east, thinking it would be a cakewalk. Instead, he marched straight into one of the most brutal ambush traps in ancient military history. Spoiler, it ends with Crassus dying and Parthian soldiers possibly pouring molten gold down his throat. Here's what the Parthians did differently. They didn't build pits or sling logs. They used psychology and geography. Their signature move? The false retreat. Mounted archers would swarm in, fire a few volleys, then act like they were panicking. Roman troops, smelling victory, chased them straight into valleys and dry riverbeds the Parthians had already prepared as kill zones. At Carrhae, Parthian scouts led Roman forces into a flat, open plain with hidden ridges on both sides. What Crassus didn't know? Behind those ridges were thousands of elite archers and camel-supplied reloading units. And the Parthians had composite bows that outranged Roman javelins by a long shot, literally. But here's where the booby trap part kicks in. Those valleys weren't just kill boxes. Some had spike pits dug behind natural cover. Others were littered with disguised caltrop fields made from bone or iron to shred horse hooves. Parthians even used wagons and brush to create fake gaps in their formation, luring Roman cavalry in before circling and cutting them down. The result? Over 20,000 Roman deaths in a single battle. Crassus tried to negotiate a retreat. The Parthians killed him anyway. The battlefield became a lesson in arrogance, terrain manipulation, and weaponized ego. Modern historians like Gareth Sampson, The Defeat of Rome, Crassus, Carrhae, and the Invasion of the East, 2008. Note how Parthians used mobile warfare, heat exhaustion, and preset terrain tricks to obliterate Rome's rigid formations. And unlike other ancient traps, this one didn't need spikes or oil. It just needed you to believe you were winning. And if a horseman in ornate armor starts running from you, maybe don't follow. Anglo-Saxon grim pits. By the early medieval period, you'd think people might have moved on from punji-style death holes. Nope. The Anglo-Saxons brought them back and added more sharp things. These were called grim pits in some regional accounts. Dug around village outskirts and forest paths, these traps were the last line of defense when Viking raids got too close. And unlike fancy Roman Lilia or Parthian ambush valleys, these were pure countryside savagery. Each pit was about 4 feet deep, just enough to swallow a charging warrior. Inside, sharpened stakes, sometimes tipped with iron, bone, or even just fire-hardened wood. These weren't military-grade engineering projects, but were community-built panic holes. Men, women, and even teenagers helped dig them when word of approaching longships hit the coast. Anglo-Saxon chronicles and early Norman invasion records reference them as fall pits or spear holes. Some were linked together with shallow trenches, allowing the defenders to maneuver while attackers dropped in. Others were rigged with primitive spring snare traps made from twisted hazel rods. Step on the wrong route, and a spiked plank swings straight into your ribs. Medieval Pinterest. In forested zones, traps were often placed near known Viking travel routes. Raiding parties would dismount to move through dense brush and bam into a pit. And even if it didn't kill you, pulling your impaled leg out while your friends ran ahead? Not ideal Viking morale. At Sutton Hoo, and later at Yorkshire excavation sites, archaeologists found remains of stake-lined pits near settlement borders. They weren't burial features, they weren't animal traps, and they were placed too deliberately to be random. These were meant to hurt someone, slow someone, or make someone bleed long enough for the town militia to show up swinging. And it worked! These pits bought time. The Saxons weren't always strong enough to hold off full-scale invasions, but a Viking warrior with a split knee and a spear in his thigh wasn't exactly raiding anyone. Nothing mechanical, nothing flashy, Just a quiet patch of grass hiding a nightmare you wouldn't notice until your leg's already ruined. That's ancient booby traps, top to bottom. And no, the modern world didn't invent savage, it just got louder.